Number 10. Fiat L640 tank. Built by Fiat, the L640 was a light tank used by the Italian military during World War II. Introduced in 1940, it was deployed in battles against the Soviet Union as well as the Balkans campaign and the North African campaign. The tank was also used for defending Italy and Sicily throughout the war. Only 3 of the armored vehicles are still around to this day. One, which likely saw combat during the Balkans campaign, sits outside Gjirokastër Castle in Albania. Dating back to the 12th century or earlier, the fortress functions as a military museum commemorating the communist struggle against imperial Western powers. In addition to the L640 tank, the site is home to a captured U.S. Air Force plane, as well as captured artillery from the resistance against German occupation. Gjirokastër Castle is a lesser-known tourist site despite all of its rich history. The decommissioned tank stands in solitude as a lonesome reminder of one of the darkest chapters in European history. The other 2 surviving L640s are in Legnano, Italy, and at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. Number 9. USS Sperry and retired nuclear submarines. Named for American inventor and entrepreneur Elmer Sperry, the USS Sperry was a type of ship called a submarine tender, which supplies and supports submarines. Built for the U.S. Navy in 1941, she was launched just 10 days after the infamous Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. During World War II, the USS Sperry spent several months in Australia where she refitted 7 submarines. In early 1943, the vessel traveled to Pearl Harbor where she spent 4 months refitting 10 submarines. From there, the ship headed to Midway Atoll in the South Pacific, where she saw the busiest period of her career. Over a span of 5 months, the Sperry serviced 70 submarines. Throughout the remainder of the war, the ship traveled back to Pearl Harbor, then to Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands before heading back to Pearl Harbor. Then she went to the Marianas Islands, then to Guam, and finally back to the U.S. After World War II ended, the Sperry ended up at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard near Los Angeles, where she underwent a modernization program in 1961. For 20 years, the vessel serviced submarines out of San Diego. She was finally decommissioned in 1982 and spent years sitting at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington alongside a collection of derelict nuclear submarines that had also been taken out of service. The ship was finally sold to a private buyer in 2011 for $1,526,726 with plans to be dismantled. By then, the Sperry had been relocated to Suisun Bay outside San Francisco, where it sat among a fleet of rusting military ships. It was finally scrapped that year. Number 8. Prince Eugene. The Prince Eugene entered service in August 1940 at the beginning of World War II as a type of Nazi naval warship called a heavy cruiser. The U.S. ultimately captured the vessel as a war prize and used it for atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll, which is part of the remote Marshall Islands archipelago in the South Pacific. In 1946, the Prince Eugene was nuked twice during these tests and capsized. It was one of dozens of vessels that were bombed as part of a project called Operation Crossroads, which sought to examine the effects of nuclear weapons on warships. Naturally, the Prince Eugene was dangerously radioactive after the experiment. The military tried and failed to decontaminate it several times, then towed it to Kwajalein Atoll where it sank 6 months later. It's still visible today, sitting upside down in the shallow water with its propellers peeking out above the surface. In 1974, experts predicted that the ship would start leaking oil into the ocean within the next 30 years if no cleanup efforts were made. The U.S. Army and Navy finally heeded these warnings in 2018 when they teamed up with the Micronesian government to remove up to 173 oil tanks from the Prince Eugene. 80 of the tanks were found to contain oil, which the crew carefully pumped out. Doing so was imperative to protecting the environment and the health of the local population, who have already suffered enough from the ill effects of radiation thanks to the nuclear testing that went on there decades ago. All of the remaining oil tanks are sealed off to prevent leftover clingage from polluting the water, and the Prince Eugene has become a popular diving site. Number 7. DavisMonthan Air Force Base. The world's largest aircraft boneyard can be found in Tucson, Arizona at the DavisMonthan U.S. Air Force Base. There are over 4,400 decommissioned aircraft parked at the sprawling 1,200-acre site, nicknamed the Boneyard, where the dry desert heat slows down the inevitable rusting process. There are planes from all over the world at DavisMonthan, and many have been there for years. While it seems like they may be going to waste, most are waiting to be recycled or brought back to life. Some of the planes are broken down for their parts, which are shipped out and reused. Others are maintained so that they're ready to be brought back into service if the need arises. The Boneyard is home to countless models of aircraft, including a collection of decommissioned B-52 bombers that are stored with their wings removed. According to the BBC, this was done as part of a strategic arms limitation treaty between the US and the Soviet Union, enabling Soviet satellites to see that the planes were taken out of service as promised. Some of the fighter jets at DavisMonthan, including the F-4 Phantom II and the F-16, are being converted into aerial target drones. There's a lot more to storing a plane than simply parking it and letting it become an afterthought. Every plane that arrives at the Boneyard is drained of its fuel. Then its fuel tank and lines are flushed out with a light oil to keep them lubricated. If a plane served on an aircraft carrier, it needs to be washed to avoid rusting from sea salt. Any and all explosive devices are removed from planes, small openings are covered with tape, and the aircraft is sprayed with several coats of easily removable paint to keep it as cool as possible and protect it from the harsh desert sun. Unfortunately, DavisMonthan is not open to the public, being an active military site and all. There used to be bus tours, but they've been suspended indefinitely at the request of the Air Force. Number 6. Lockheed Martin Sea Shadow. Designed for the U.S. Navy during the early 1980s, the Lockheed Martin Sea Shadow was an experimental ship that was built to explore the use of stealth technology on naval vessels. It was essentially designed to be the marine equivalent of the F-117 Nighthawk fighter jet. If it looks familiar, that's probably because the vessel in the Bond movie Tomorrow Never Dies was modeled after the Sea Shadow. The futuristic vehicle featured a science fiction-like swath, that is, a small waterplane area twin-hull design, which helped it stay stable even in rough seas. In fact, it was rated to withstand waves measuring up to 18 feet high, otherwise known as Sea State 6. The interior was very basic, yet contained several state-of-the-art automation systems not found in any other ships. Inside the Spartan ship, there were 12 bunks, a microwave, a table, and a fridge. But these fixtures didn't receive much use. The Sea Shadow was launched in 1984 but was kept secret from the public until 1993. Only one prototype was ever made, despite its capabilities. The Navy tried to auction it off in 2006, but nobody bought it. For the next 6 years, the Sea Shadow was stored inside of a mining bulge at Suisun Bay in San Francisco, which was once home to an aging ghost fleet of abandoned ships. It was dismantled in 2012. Although the Sea Shadow itself never took off, the project wasn't a complete loss. The ship's distinctively shaped hull and stabilizer have been incorporated into many vessels, giving them an advantage with intelligence missions. Number 5. Murmansk. The Soviet cruiser Murmansk was built during the early 1950s. It put in many years of service for the Soviet Union before it was decommissioned and sold to an India-based company for scrap in 1994. Plans were made to tow the ship from the Arctic Ocean to its new home, but the tugboat's cable snapped shortly after departing from Norway and the Murmansk ran aground. It sat in place with a heavy list for several years, becoming somewhat of a tourist attraction in the meantime. Fishermen and conservationists became increasingly concerned about the wrecked vessel's effects on the environment. Experts actually predicted that storms would destroy the ship a long time ago, yet it remained in one piece until 2009. That year, the Norwegian government finally had the Murmansk removed. The wreck was too damaged to be moved by conventional means, so workers built a breakwater and a dry dock around it. Once the ship dried up, they dismantled it piece by piece. Scientists ruled out the presence of polonium and other dangerous radioactive substances, but some researchers think that these findings are wrong. But if there were any hazardous chemicals on the Murmansk, we'll probably never know about it because the ship was recycled and is long gone. Number 4. Flamenco Beach Tanks. There's a collection of rusting World War II-era tanks dotting the beach along Puerto Rico's Culebra Island. Covered in colorful graffiti, they look strangely out of place against the white sand and the turquoise Caribbean Sea. The American military began using Culebra Island in 1901 after Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the U.S. at the end of the Spanish-American War. That same year, President Theodore Roosevelt gave the island's public territory to the U.S. Navy. Although no official base was ever established at Culebra Island, the military carried out bombing and other weapons practice there for decades. At one point, the military tried evicting the local population from the island, but they fought back by staging peaceful protests against the Navy's occupation of their home. The military eventually conceded and agreed to leave Culebra Island. By 1975, there were few remaining signs of its former presence. Navy personnel cleaned up the smaller pieces of equipment that had been left behind, but the tanks are still there today. dotting the shoreline as they decay in the salty sea breeze. Number 3. Vozdvizhenka Aircraft Graveyard. Located in Russia's far east near the Sea of Japan, Vozdvizhenka is a former Soviet airbase that dates at least as far back as the Cold War era. Relatively little is known about the site, which is home to at least 18 gutted Tupolev Tu-22M supersonic bombers. According to a declassified CIA document from 1969, Vozdvizhenka was the only Soviet base east of the Ural Mountains that housed the Tupolev Tu-22M. Nicknamed the Blinder, it entered service in 1962 as the first supersonic bomber ever produced in the USSR. But the aircraft underperformed compared to its maker's expectations as far as range and speed go. The Tupolev Tu-22M was produced in small numbers and was difficult to fly and maintain. It was prone to crashing as well as pitching up and striking its tail during landing. But it was still used in war. In fact, it was one of the few Soviet bombers to ever see combat, having been used in the Iran-Iraq War and in skirmishes against Tanzania and Chad. Tu-22s were also sold to other countries including Libya and Iraq. Still, the aircraft's glory days were short-lived, and the seemingly post-apocalyptic atmosphere at Vozdvizhenka is reminiscent of a bygone era. Number 2. Bartini Beriev VVA-14 plane. The Cold War was marked by a frenzied arms race between the US and the Soviet Union, who competed to amass a bigger and better stockpile just in case actual physical war broke out. One of the USSR's priorities was to prepare for possible deep-sea missile strikes. During the 1970s, the Soviet Navy worked to combat these threats with the development of the Bartini Beriev VVA-14 plane. This amphibious aircraft was tasked with defending the Soviet border by detecting American submarines. Named after Italian designer Robert Bartini, the strange-looking aircraft was perched on pontoons. Manned by a 3-person crew, it was capable of vertical takeoff and could also take off and land in the water. The Bartini Beriev VVA-14 also worked by skimming along the water while it patrolled for enemy submarines. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, with one logging 103 flight hours over 107 flights before the project was ultimately scrapped. Just one of the prototypes survives today. It sits near the Russian Air Force Museum in Monino, outside Moscow. In 2013, a group of aviation enthusiasts campaigned for its revival, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Number 1. Chassaloop Laubad. The port of Nouadhibou in Mauritania functions as the world's largest ship graveyard. At any given time, you can find the hulls of some 300 abandoned vessels at the site, rotting away under the sun. The first ship to be left behind at Nouadhibou was the French Navy cruiser Chassaloop Laubad. It was built during the 1890s in response to growing fears about what German and Italian naval fleets were capable of. After World War I, the French military decommissioned the vessel and sold it to a private fishery, which used it as a water cistern and a floating warehouse. The Chassaloop Laubad sank at Nouadhibou in 1926, marking the beginning of the massive ship graveyard that's there now. The collection of derelict vehicles accumulated over time, largely due to corrupt politicians who are willing to take bribes from ship owners who are looking to skirt around environmental laws. At one point, the Chassaloop Laubad was converted into a floating theater. Soon enough, however, it went back to being nothing more than a hunk of rusting metal, much like all the other vessels in the port. The ship graveyard is a fascinating sight, but it's incredibly dangerous to the environment, especially since Mauritania lacks the infrastructure to properly dismantle the boats. Thanks for watching. Which one of these abandoned military vehicles was the most interesting to you? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time for another exciting video right here on American Eye.